Hello, everybody. We might as well get started. Uh, my name is Brian Gillis. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Art and also the director of our Center for Art Research, what we call CFAR. It's my pleasure to introduce Hamza Walker as the Ford Family Foundation's 2021 Critical Conversations Curator and Critic Tour Visitor for the University of Oregon, who today will be in conversation with Mahfuz Sultan. I'd like to begin by taking a moment to recognize that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Alihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to communities, institutions, the University of Oregon, the state of Oregon, the United States, and to the world. In acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we extend our respect to the indigenous people of Oregon and all other displaced indigenous people who call Oregon home. With today's conversation and our collective activity, we recognize Oregon's first people as the past, present, and future stewards of this land, and we pledge our commitment to make ongoing efforts to center Indigenous existence in the work we do. The Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts program honors the foundation's late co-founder, Haley Ford, and her lifelong interests in the arts by helping Oregon's most promising visual artists actively pursue their work. One element of the program is Critical Conversations, a collaboration between the foundation and the University of Oregon in partnership with the Pacific Northwest College of Art, Portland State University, and Reed College. Critical Conversations is a nexus space for the work of artists and cultural producers that manifests as fertile medium through which exchange, collaboration, and new forms of inquiry are catalyzed. Organizing partners facilitate a year-round calendar of studio visits for Oregon artists by 3 prominent visiting curators or critics, host related public lectures and other forms of engagement with these visitors, and oversee a series of convenings that engage community participants around currents in society in the field. In addition to events like today's, engagement is made accessible to broader audiences through a variety of platforms, including Critical Conversations annual publication, which we are launching this year, as such that gathers content from a range of activities and commissions writing around a theme. In May, we'll be releasing our first publication dedicated to the notion of figuring. In addition to today's talk, studio visits with Oregon artists in the next couple of weeks, Hamza will also be contributing a written piece to next year's publication. This program is such a gift to artists and cultural producers in the state of Oregon, and I am so grateful to Critical Conversations founders, Kate Wogley, UO Professor Emeritus, the Ford Family Foundation's former senior advisor to the visual arts program, Candace Brewer-Nunn, for initiating, sustaining, and expanding the program over the last 10 years to be what it is today. In addition to Candace and Kate, I also want to acknowledge and thank the people who represent our partner institutions and who together have brought the state of Oregon such exceptional group of visionary curators and critics. Thank you, Stephanie Snyder, director and curator of the Cooley Gallery at Reed College, Mac McFarland, the executive director of Converge 45 and interim representative for PNCA, Marianne Ramirez, the director of the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at PSU, Sue Taylor, professor emeritus at PSU, and Megan Attia, the senior advisor for the Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts program. I'd also like to give a big thanks to Laura Butler Hughes, Critical Conversations program coordinator, and Wendy Heldman, CFAR's program coordinator, for their essential help with more things than we have time to mention here. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions made by my colleagues in the Department of Art, CFAR board members Tanaz Farsi and Rick Silva, and the unyielding support of our department head, Amanda Wojcik, school director Charlene Liu, and Dean of the College of Design, Laura Vandenberg. The opportunities to invite someone here through programs like Critical Conversations are truly invaluable, as these occasions are a chance for us to take stock of who we are and what priorities we may have, what currents in the world relate to the work we do, and what issues need further consideration. Hamza Walker's work has a fundamental relationship to the collective goals of our community, and at this time feels crucial to the work we're doing in navigating matters related to power, fraught regional histories, institutional structures of bias, and issues of identity, equity, inclusion, and access. And we are so grateful that he accepted our invitation to come here and contribute to this work. I feel obliged to introduce Hamza through his professional record, which might describe posts in Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs, his long-held position at the Renaissance Society, or the work he's done in his position at LaxArt, where he's been since 2016, or the numerous projects he's facilitated around the world, and all the ways that outfits like the New York Times have referred to him as one of the museum world's most talented essayists, or one of the 7 most influential curators in the country. But these are all things that can easily be found online and maybe just superficially legitimizes the excellence of his status in the field or the choice we made to invite him. I'm more interested in talking about the ways Hamza has used the positions he's been in and the opportunities he's had to impact people and communities through access to contemporary art that broaches social issues from so many positions that use such a range of logics, from teen paranormal romance at the Renaissance Society, intimate portraiture, or the re-examination of modernist visionaries, or a recent project at LaxArt called Some Reach While Others Clap, where the interdisciplinary art collective Post-Commodity functions as a shared indigenous lens through which to examine and respond to the ongoing narrative of colonialism. His work gives space to both subtle and direct interrogation of ideas that may not always be easy to negotiate in public or private spaces. And he does this responsively by honoring artists' individual compasses in ways that are both direct and circuitous, and allow for what seems like a certain degree of magic as he facilitates work that exists within, on, and outside institutional spaces in fresh ways with resonant energy. Since we've transitioned to Zoom for events like this, I've been less and less interested in the typical lecture and convinced that there's something in the medium that could be altogether different. In talking through options with Hamza, the idea to just be in conversation with someone came up, and he was immediately so excited to be in conversation with Mahfuz, who from what I can gather is an old friend who intimately knows Hamza's work, and they have a long history of looking into things together. So in addition to having the occasion to have another amazing brain such as Mahfuz Sultan's, who's an architect, writer, and founder of Clocks, a research space and design practice in Los Angeles, it feels really special to be able to bear witness to 2 friends thinking through things together. And I'm so grateful for the occasion to be here today. So without any further ado, please help me give a hearty, digital, virtual welcome to Hamza and Mahfuz. I'll be the only one to clap. There's millions of people clapping out there.
Yes, I'm actually gonna share my screen. One of the things that, actually I'm just gonna share the entire screen. That's just easier, and I can full screen it. One of the things that, can you see it, Hamza? Are we up there?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I was gonna say that like one of the approaches that I thought would be most productive for this talk, because I think you've done so much in your career, and it's very difficult to sort of capture all of it in sort of one chat, is to sort of use our friendship and some of these shows that recur in our conversations that you've done as a through line. And so I think we're just going to go through these sort of like Beavis and Butthead and have like running commentary on each show. Um,
I get to be butthead.
yeah,
I
awesome.
call butthead.
So, so when I first met you, I asked you at some point in the dinner where you were from, and you said Baltimore. Then you said violence, violence, silence, right? And so I'm sort of setting this up as an origin myth, the sort of neon on the outside of the Baltimore Museum of Art. And at the risk of being long-winded about this, I'm gonna let you answer in a second. I'm gonna come to a question. I thought it was I thought it was really, really fascinating for me, because usually when people in the arts give origin myths, sort of like high school experiences, et cetera, they're not Bruce Nauman. And they're not work like this, that's site-specific, linguistic, engaged in sort of institutional critique, questions about the art object. And so I wanted to sort of hear you opine about your relationship to this neon and Nauman before going to college, you know?
Yeah. Well, this is, it's a great piece. And
Awesome.
it was, the thing about it is not knowing that it was art. I mean, that was not knowing, you know, being 16 years old, rip racing and running the streets of Baltimore. And my best friend at the time was David Earl. And we'd go and see punk shows. And the Baltimore Museum of Art is up around near Hopkins, Charles Village.
Mm-hmm.
And when this piece went up, it was just, I guess, you know, we knew it was on the outside of the museum, I guess, but just this thing that would flash silence, violence, violins, you know, intermittently. And we just found ourselves laughing and thought it was the coolest thing. You know, no knowledge about Bruce Nauman at all, which is the best, I think, the best compliment that we could pay to the artist, right? It didn't matter to us. We didn't know, what is this an ad for? We didn't care, you know, we just thought silence, violence, violins, that's cool. Yeah, and it just stuck, you know, and only later, you know, coming to realize like, oh, it's a Bruce Nauman, you know, after the fact. So to have something that's just in one's environment, right, that's a very potent work, right, that just, you know, and the power of the piece to stay with a 16-year-old and to carry it. And, you know, there were things along the way, but this was truly one of those works that, as far as an introduction to contemporary art, let's call it, that's an introduction, no introduction at all. You know, that's still important.
I was going to say, it's kind of like funny as we look at some of your shows in the Ren, it's funny to look back on that, because when I first saw this, you know, I lived for a long time in the DC area growing up, and when I first saw this neon, I think I wondered what its objective was. Like, I was like, what is it? Like, what is it trying to do? I kind of also didn't actually know that it was art per se. Like, I was just like, that's bizarre signage. Like, what are they trying to do? Why does it bend the corner? And so as we sort of look at other shows that you've been a part of, you've experienced at sort of various points in your career, I think it's interesting to look back on it as a sort of point of departure. So now this is Asher, untitled, as it always is.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, this is after Michael Asher showed at the Renaissance Society in 1990. This was after I was out 1988. So this is a couple years after, but I was a member of the Renaissance Society and went to all their shows, both as an undergraduate and, you know, continuously to go see the shows. And I remember this show, I mean, starkly. Is there another way to remember it? And these patent numbers actually refer to the devices, very small devices, the knob on the radiator grill and the window sashes, the lock in the window sashes. So it's the whole show was about the relationship between art and industry. And it's site specific. Now on the other side of these walls, it's painted maroon. So the piece was done, you know, I mean, to say site specific in the most literal fashion possible. One, by having these patent numbers refer to fixtures in the gallery. There's that, right? So a reference to the formal architectural features, no matter how minor, of the space. But on the other side, painted maroon, which is the University of Chicago color, school color, were photographs of members of the Department of Sociology at the university. And Michael Asher went and found quotes from them about the relationship between art and industry. And so he had pictures of them, and then he had their quotes about the relationship between art and industry. And there was one from Thorsten Veblen, who's probably the best known of the figures that he chose. And I can't remember the other figures, but there were a number of them, 5, 6 different University of Chicago faculty. But yeah, this was, and this would have been my introduction to Michael Asher's work, would have been through this exhibition. And probably concurrently at the same time, my very dear friends at the time, Chris Hansen and Hendrika Sonnenberg, they went to the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. They had all the NASCAD publications, one of which was the collected writings of Michael Asher. So it was kind of a 1-2 punch to see this exhibition and then to become even more familiar with him through the writings. Or it could have been the other way around. I could have seen the book just then and then seen this show, but they would have been, pretty much concurrent as an introduction. It's nice to see.
Funny, it's especially salient at a university, right? In part because I think that when people often think about architecture, they don't necessarily think of buildings as sort of aggregations of building products, right? Like products purchased, sourced from a building industry that has like patented certain sorts of objects, right? That are then acquired and used. And so it's like a super weighty form of institutional critique. You know what I mean? To sort of think about a building in a gallery that way.
Yeah, well, in terms of the figures that Michael Asher chose, this would have been the late 19th, early 20th century, not late 19th, early 20th century. And it would have been the Beaux-Arts movement, right? So I think there would have been, in terms of urbanization, industrialization, and how to, thinking, a predecessor would have been somebody like William Morris, right? In terms of how the artisan, the craftsman is going to be incorporated into industrialization, right? And making of things, right? And so I think that was kind of the rhetoric and the discourse, right? It belonged to an arts and crafts moment, on the other side of the building. But yeah, it was a great show.
There we go. And that's you.
Yes, that's me, even though much more sexy now.
Yeah. Felix Gonzalez Torres, Perfect Lovers, Untitled. There were several other works, but
this is great also because this is what our offices used to look like. This is so on the image on the right to the left, that is Suzanne's desk. And then the desk on the right is my desk. So we were, this is clearly not a COVID-friendly situation. There were 3 people in this little office. But Felix installed works in the offices, so people had to come into the spaces to see the show, which of course is the whole idea about what's the relationship between public and private, right? Tearing down the barrier between those spaces. And it was very nice to have people just kind of wander in and to just be able to have conversations with them. But I don't know, with the photograph of Perfect Lovers, I don't know what compelled me to sit in the chair, because it would have been Tom Vinendi is the photographer who did all the documentation of the Renaissance Society. And I don't know what would have compelled me to sit in the chair that we would have needed one with a human presence. It would have been the evening. That's when we had the time, right? 6:30, right there to market. But what's funny about the picture is, I think Felix died in '96, but just before he died, he had the show at the Guggenheim. And I came into work one day and I walked in, and that desk, Pat Scott, she was the office manager. She sat at that desk. So I came in and she was on the phone with somebody. And as I came in, she said, "Oh, he's right here. He just walked into the office." So whoever was wanted to talk to me. And she said, "Okay, let me transfer the call over." Transfer the call over. I picked up the phone and I didn't know who it was. So when I picked up the phone, it was just this voice. And it just said, "Hi, Hamza. Look on page 93. Okay, bye. Hope you like it." And then it just hung up. And I said, "Pat, who was that called?" And she said, "It was Felix." And I said, "Oh, he didn't announce himself." And I didn't know what he was talking about. I had no idea. And I mean, it must have been several months, a while before I got a copy of the catalog for the show. And he was referring to the page on which he reproduced this picture, which I thought was very, very sweet and very touching, that he just reached out and said, "Hey, thinking about you, I put you in the book." And that was all, but very much like the work in terms of all the people that he touched. And so this picture does occupy a particular spot in my heart, for that reason.
Yeah, it's funny.
But yeah, but this was the first show that I worked on at the Renaissance Society.
Right. And I was actually going to point out that I don't know, this must have been a couple years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago. We were sort of sitting around having dinner with my partner Chloe, and we were joking about, we were like, man, like my favorite photo of Perfect Lovers has this just really cool black dude that photobombed Felix's shot. Like what possessed this guy to just sit down and start thumbing through a book during the shot? And you were like, "It was me."
That's right. That's true. That's right.
We had to go look it up. Yeah, we had to go find the photo.
That's right. And I said, "That's true." You said that, and I was just like, "Yeah, that's me in that photograph." That's very funny. I forgot about that.
Actually, transitioning to Black Is Black Ain't, I'm kind of like working through this without chronology, because I think it was, I kind of wanted to prompt you on sort of offering up the idea of offering up the Ren as like raw material for artists to work on, right? Like that's obviously something that occurred with like Asher and Felix, but also with like group shows. This idea that like artists would come in and sort of occupy the space in a potentially incendiary way, right? Like really sort of like transform its processes.
Yeah.
Wanted to get you to talk about this show in particular because it's a big group show of Black artists like Terry Atkins, Pope L, Glenn Ligon, Hank Willis Thomas, Nicolene Thomas, the list goes on and on. And there like wasn't really, I haven't researched this, but to my mind, there wasn't really a group show of Black artists like this outside like New York for this particular group that I'd ever heard of.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny that you would mention that because I actually imposed quotas on this show. So I think the show is like 55-45, 55% Black, 45% non-Black. I think I may have been going for 50-50, I think. And I thought of this, if ever there's going to be a healthy space in which to exercise quotas. Right. But part of the reason for that was to want to do an exhibition about race, right? Mm-hmm. But with the understanding that an exhibition of all Black artists no longer could pass as an exhibition about race. So I think that was one of the key takeaways from freestyle, right? So this show, in part, one of the cues to do the show was it's in some sense a response, a rebuttal, I don't know what to call it, to freestyle. So a show that was 10 years earlier, right? So where Thelma, doing freestyle, she said, okay, here we have a crop of young Black talent or whatever, but who are under no obligation whatsoever to address the issue of race, mm-hmm. right? So in a sense, like, Elvis has left the building or something. I don't know how to put it. I don't know what kind of metaphor that is, but the Elvis has left the building. I think I used that word. Elvis has left the building, but the building is still standing. So that's how I felt about the issue of race. It's like, wait, the building is still there. So what about that? So with that as the principle, it couldn't be all Black artists. You know, so again, a good portion of the artists are not Black in the show, which is important. I can't remember what else you were in terms of mentioning it. There was one of the artists, Tom Johnson. He had a video in the show, and he came. It's a brilliant video which features him doing a monologue about race, and he's white. And he proposed to come out, and during the exhibition, he would sit in the gallery and watch his video of him delivering the monologue. And he actually did that, but he could only stay for half of the run of the exhibition because his wife was expecting at the time. So he had to return. He was living in Italy. He's still living in Italy. He had to return to Italy because they had a child. But it was incredible. Only a couple of visitors happened to notice that the man who was sitting on the bench watching the video happened to be the man in the video. So that was a pretty bold performance on his part, in addition to the video itself being incredible. So yeah, so in terms of a way of incorporating an update or a new version of that piece or a performative version of that piece, being able to work that into a show of largely pre-existing works was quite nice.
And this was like Obama's election year, right? So there was like a sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of critique of a lot of the discourse around post-race.
Well, actually, I started the show like 3 years before.
Right.
At least two and a half years before I started. So this was well before, you know, Obama wasn't on anybody's radar, you know, at that time in terms of.
When you started the show, yeah. Of course, the show was generative of discourse and of conversation at the time. It's sort of track, right? I mean, I think the show is how you read it when it opens, right? To a certain extent.
Right. And it hit. I mean, he gave the speech. I mean, somewhere very close. I think this would have been the spring of 2008, I think was the show. Spring of 2008. Yeah. So the election hadn't happened yet, but obviously the race was in full swing, you know, but not full swing. I mean, summer would have been the full swing, but I think it was at that time, race in terms of the election had just emerged as an issue. I remember that being one of the Tribune's headlines. But he gave the speech. That's what everybody refers to it as, the speech, which was the one before, which is an amazing piece of oratory, right? Before he even became about race. And a lot of his advisors at the time told him not to do it, you know, and I think that was incredible that he just, you know, said, no, gonna do it, and went headlong into it. So.
Oh, see, yeah. I jumped ahead. Teen paranormal romance.
Oh, yeah. So this is, this is a real, as far as a group exhibition, and you've got Wayne Guyton and Kelly Walker in the foreground. Mm-hmm. Catherine Andrews is the in the background, and the one on the left. Oh my God, I'm blanking on her name. She's from Georgia on the right here. But this was my daughter was a voracious reader. I mean, she must have been at that time 12, and her heavy duty book habit. And she was, I think I was buying her like the Sookie Stackhouse novels, which is what True Blood is based on. Divergent. I can't remember. It was a trilogy that was coming out, and it was The Hunger Games. Mm-hmm. But she was a voracious reader. So one of them was coming out. I usually would take her to the used bookstore to buy these things, you know. And so we had to go to a Barnes and Noble and something. And the sign, teen paranormal romance, was actually a genre, a sign that they had for this genre. And I felt as though it was being served up to me on a platter as an exhibition. But it was just interesting about youth culture in terms of the purchase that young adult fiction had on the culture industry, and still does, not just the publishing industry, but the culture industry at that time. So Scholastic, I mean, the Harry Potter books, but that was pretty much the cash cow for the publishing industry, and by extension also, again, like movies and culture at large. So that was kind of the inspiration for the show. But it was interesting. I spoke with at the time I was doing it, Seth Price wrote an essay called "The Teen Image," and I spoke to him. We happened to be cross paths at this conference thing, and I said, Seth, you know, the teen image. I'm doing this show about young adult fiction that has young adult as its inspiration or something like that. And he said, hey, if you put teen in anything, people are going to turn heads. If you put teen, putting teen in something is like an invitation. Everybody has something to say about teenagers, right? And I was like, no. And sure enough, that was the first thing that people latched onto. What does this have to say about teens? Teens. And the way that it was being brought up was that like the teen somehow was some kind of underrepresented or marginalized voice. And that was driving me absolutely crazy, because it's like teenagers are anything but I don't know about your Netflix queue, and maybe that says something about whatever algorithm Netflix
right.
on my choices, but it's like, I mean, exactly. It's like the purchase that demographic has on popular culture is huge in terms of as a market force and as a voice. So it just tickled me to no end. Like people kept coming and expecting it to be some form of direct representation in that regard. And it was much more a set of musings, let's call it. But the real excuse for a lot of the group shows that I was doing at the time was just what kinds of equations could I come up with to show art, you know, right? So group exhibitions is a way of showing work that and it forces another kind of read of artwork at the level of the individual pieces rather than the artist per se, right? So it's an excuse to really look at works one at a time by an artist, as opposed to thinking about them in aggregate, right? So to try and come up with more flexible, more subjective, let's say, equations that would allow for combinations of work, right? To create new kinds of contexts for work, and a kind of a lightness of thinking. And the titles of things, I think the titles of these shows, I think of them as very, very important in terms of keying up how to engage with them, right? Almost as like lines from poems in and of themselves, in a way. So
yeah, absolutely. Suicide Narcissists, All the Pretty Corpses.
All the Pretty Corpses.
I remember All the Pretty Corpses. Yeah, absolutely. I think this one stood out to me in part because it felt like it somehow rhymed in a kind of obverse way with Black is Black Hate. Just not to tether it to the Obama era, because I think that's a bit facile, but I think there was a sense in which some of the sort of bizarre energies of 2014, right? They were sort of like ahead of. It kind of felt, looking back on it now, a lot of the sort of dark energy from some of the darker corners of the internet manifesting themselves in kind of latent ways in the production of artworks over a certain period of time. I mean, they certainly pop up first in like YA novels for sure. Anyways, I'm in danger of digressing because you reminded me. Last night I was watching Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I found myself, and I was kind of thinking about this conversation while I was watching it, and I remember this show partially because I found it so strange how actors or stars that like emerge or take hold first as younger teenage stars, have a staying power that is unbelievable, you know, like, and you look at like Keanu Reeves or like Leonardo DiCaprio, or you look at more recently figures like like a Kristen Stewart, right? Like, why does Olivier Assayas watch Wicked and go like, oh man, you know who I need? I need Kristen Stewart in my like sort of like auteurist French indie cinema. Like, why sort of her? And so, anyways, this like show had that kind of energy for me. This kind of bizarre like American fixation with teen emergence or something.
Yeah. And what was the one with Kristen Stewart? What was the one that the Twilight series?
Twilight series.
That was
Yeah,
one,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right.
Robert
Another one that was
Pattinson, and like that kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sakula. So I threw Sakula in because, yeah, I mean, he's the, you know, he's the master. So, and I kind of wanted to I wanted to hear you sort of wax philosophical about Alan Sakula, not just this show, because I think he's someone that's influenced you a lot, and then in turn he's influenced me a lot through you and also around you.
Yeah. I mean, you know, when I think about that, you know, that old chestnut of art and politics, you know, having been introduced to Alan School's work, you know, through Benjamin Buchloh when he was teaching. He taught just for a semester at the University of Chicago, and then later seeing his Photography Against the Grain is one of the NASCAD publications. But his writings had appeared in any number of anthologies at the time. But as far as a kind of a politics of photography in the way that the means of representation has its own, you know, how to think through the politics of the medium, let's say, right? You know, so that it isn't necessarily a question of the content, right, as the marker of the politics, but how, you know, not what is photographed, but how something might be photographed, right? Where the politics. So the relationship between word and image, I mean, at a very basic level, right? The whole idea of what does a photograph, you know, what is a photograph could just as soon lie to us, right? What's the relationship between the photograph and the caption, right? So it isn't this simply kind of modernist vision of the image functioning in, you know, a pure visuality, like functioning just in and of itself, but it is accompanied with information. And what is that information, right? And also a certain level of discursivity, right? The photographs talk to one another. So for example, the photograph on the right is a young day trader. And that's the Chicago Stock Exchange. And it's a direct opposite, you know, almost of the famous photographs by both Thomas Ruth and Thomas Struth of the Chicago Stock Exchange, where they have the kind of the frantic moment, you know, in the pit, right?
Yep.
But that was pre-internet, right? When they took their pictures, when the Chicago Stock Exchange at its busiest, right? They photographed it at its peak, you know. So in terms of like, how do you raise capitalism to visuality, right? Like, you know, go down to the pit. Here's an image of it, you know, being enacted or played out somehow as performances. But so to take a picture, you know, 17 years later after day trading, when there's a decline, you know, there aren't as many traders on the floor, right? We've gone to electronic day trading, right? And this female trader just standing dead center. And so Alan referred to this as delightfully as a bad photograph, right? Of just her standing there. And he blew it up. I can't remember the film he was shooting, so it's quite grainy, you know, in terms of its resolution. But it was front and center when you entered the show, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember right. And but just so beautiful in terms of the way that it spoke to the other two photographs. So yeah, so he was just a real important figure, he and Martha Rossler, about, you know, politics of representation through his writings. On the left, this photograph was 2008, right after Obama took office. There was a strike that got national attention, and it was a factory that made like storm windows.
Mm-hmm.
And the workers went on strike. It got national attention, And it was just as Obama just won the election. So there was, given that he'd come out of Chicago, Illinois, there was some question about, which side he was on. I think he was on or something. But anyway, Alan took me to this strike. And it was the first real factory occupation sit-in that I had attended. And it was really beautiful. Just, he's like, I was driving us there and he said, okay, we got to stop at Dunkin' Donuts. Let's pick up some coffee. Let's pick up some food. And this was just a normal, ritual. You come bearing food for, to show solidarity with the workers. But just things like that, really, really beautiful. Now, he was influential, to me in my way of thinking, when I was, in college and all the way through. So it's really beautiful just some odd years later to get to know him and call him a friend. And to do things like, we did the May Day parade together, right? We also went to, there's a whole series of photographs that he took of Fred Hampton. He wanted to go to Fred Hampton's, to Maywood, which is where Fred Hampton is from. So we went to the only memorial that he could find to Fred Hampton, which is a water park in Maywood. And he took pictures of the water park, and there's a bust of Fred Hampton at the water park in Maywood. And he was tickled by that. So then we also did the May Day parade together, and we were running along and he was taking photographs, and then a group that was on a float, they pointed him out and hoisted Alan up onto the float. So he was taking pictures of the parade from the vantage point of the float as well. But it was just very beautiful just to go with him and see him shoot and to get to know him, before he passed. But it was a fabulous show. And again, it must have been 3 or so years in the making. Polonia. It was about and he's Polish, Polish descent. So about the Polish population in Chicago. So it was a way of looking at Chicago, a number of through lines in terms of, his own biography, right? Then him relating to Chicago, just a really beautiful way that he would work and just the same kinds of themes and just keep working them, even when it was a new setting, right? So a way of taking a whole set of earlier concerns or earlier ongoing concerns and then mapping those onto Chicago. So just a beautiful, beautiful show. But yeah.
Oh, Kara. Yeah. I center aligned the title. I thought it was fitting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There's not a specific question on this. I just thought that when I look back on a lot of the shows from the 90s at the Red, there's this, I don't know, I want to choose my words. A lot of the shows during the 90s had this kind of dialogue, this kind of ongoing dialogue, I think, between you and the other curators at the Ren, and a certain sort of Central European curatorial tradition, these ideas of a publication with every single show, with an essay by the curator every single show, things like page works, posters, sort of a proliferation of printed matter around each show, the types of artists often engaged in institutional critique that use the sort of architecture of the gallery or use the sort of institutional architecture. And the thing I liked about Kara's work in particular during that time, or part of why it stood out for me, is that she did so much of it with drawing.
Mm-hmm.
So much of it. So it operates at the same register from from the standpoint of mounting institutional cultural critique, but its touch is very soft, for lack of a better word. It's a soft touch with sort of a very dramatic detonation. And so I wanted to sort of ask you about this particular show. I mean, there's a classic publication. I can actually go dig it up.
Yeah, it was great. She had made, I mean, maybe, I I'm gonna say half to 2/3, half of the work maybe she had made before and sent it out rolled up in two. And the other half, we bought the black photo backdrop paper and rolled it out in the corridor in Cobb Hall, so the hallway outside the gallery. And she worked on it. Now, there are classrooms, you know the fourth floor of Cobb Hall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So she was working in the hallway, drawing with chalk onto the black paper rolled out along the corridor while students were going back and forth to class and stuff. So she was just right out there in the open, making the drawings and making the work and then cutting it, which was quite incredible. Now, there is, the scroll that's in the middle of that piece, that sepia scroll, which says nigger lover, to the left of that are two figures. There's a mammy figure, and this is going to be hard to make out for the home audience. The mammy figure has a tongue, a very large tongue, comes out of her mouth, and there's like liquid dripping from her tongue, and she's looking at a nude, a bather, a white woman who is drying herself with a towel. So that vignette of those two characters. Now, those two characters, there was a show at the Art Institute. They had a Degas show. And so there were the Degas bathers, and those are ones that I always think of, like it's as if Degas was looking through a, keyhole or something, at the bathers kind of thing. So Kara went down and saw the Degas show that day and came back. I was still at the gallery working late. She came back, it must have been late afternoon, early evening, 4 or 5, and said she wanted to work some. So I said, yeah, no problem. I'm, stay late, I can order some pizza. She kicked out that drawing, those two figures and that was all based on the Degas show. So in terms of like call and response, to watch her see something and then immediately, volley the ball back within hours was quite phenomenal and quite beautiful to see the speed at which she was working. So it's like, think it, draw it, so just like input, output, don't sweat the technique. And that was quite beautiful to watch her just so fluid, in terms of thinking, joking, drawing. So really nice to see her in the process, but it was a really important moment. She was on the eve of getting the MacArthur. It was just the controversy was right after this show was mounted, that the letter writing campaign led by Betty Saar and Howardina Pindell, about the kind of recognition that she was getting, that was right just around the bend from this exhibition. So none of the stuff that I wrote, or in terms of how I was thinking about it, was at all tempered by that debate, which had yet to be. But then, I found myself, in terms of, interviews and subsequent writing about the work, having to kind of, not work my way through those kinds of arguments, but to address them in a sense. So.
For sure. I mean, yeah, it is really badass work. It's really badass work. It cuts both ways too. I mean, anyways, I don't want to digress. Digressing in praise of this work. But yeah, made in LA.
Oh yeah. And this is a great.
We should just begin with the title.
The title, which is a piece in the show.
Yeah.
And it was great. I remember this very, very clearly. Aram Moshietti, my partner in crime on the show, Aram and I, we were having lunch at the Whole Foods. We were sitting at tables outside of the Whole Foods in Westwood, just blocks from the Hammer Museum. And he said, we're missing something. There's a certain register that we're missing in the show, like the title of the show, and maybe we should just like invite a poet to title the show and have that be the piece. And I thought that was brilliant, and I believe at that time we'd done a studio visit with Aram Saroyan. And then and just a light bulb went off to just say, hey, let's approach Aram Saroyan and invite him to do the title for the show. So he came up with a, the, though only, which is his contribution to the show, which I thought was very beautiful. Now, his first proposal for a title, R and I, and we laughed for a very, very long time. And I doubt that we could keep a straight face looking at each other when we look back on this. Aram Saroyan's first suggestion for a title. So, Made in LA, you know, obviously that's the title of the show. So his idea for a title for our iteration was, it would be Made in LA. Made in LA. I don't entirely agree. That was that was going to be the title. So that was one of a few proposals that he made for the title. So we chose this one, A, the, though only, was the one that Aram Moshietti and I settled on. But we laughed quite hard about the other title, I don't entirely agree. As being nice. But yeah, he thought about this as a collection of words, which I just thought was brilliant. Just like a poem, as like the idea of just like picking things up randomly, like this, and this, right? And then this is your poem, right? Just a grouping, you know.
And I mean, how did you think about you know, speaking of like picking things up at random, how did you feel about how heterogeneous the group was? I mean, this was like a really tight show. As I recall, it was super like succinct. Like, I don't remember how many artists in total it was.
26.
26, there we go, right? But it was also like,
I can't forget, not because of, you know, I mean, they were all related, 26 gasoline stations, but, you know,
yeah, right.
Why did Edward Shake choose 26? Like, you know, letters in the alphabet. So.
How did you guys go about selecting artists, the two of you collaborating on something like that?
God, it was really organic. There was no.
Edward Shea was in it, right? Edward Shea was in it, and Sterling Ruby was in it, but also like.
Oh no, he was. Edward Shea wasn't in it.
Oh no, he wasn't. He was right.
Yeah, but yeah, there was no. I mean, it depends on what you see. Yeah, there was no. God, I can't remember what we. Did we have any real guiding? I mean, there were a couple things that we were, but it was more like, it's like what we didn't want to do rather than what we did do. That was the guiding thing, you know. And I think we made like one, and I wish I could remember what it was, but I feel as though we made one key decision very, very early on about something that ended up being, I think, kind of important in terms of how we may have been thinking about things at a structural level. But that was about it. Other than that, we didn't, there was no give or take or back and forth. I mean, we were all in 100% over all the choices. So it never devolved down into which are yours or which are mine or whatever, that kind of a thing. You know, we were on the same page. Yeah.
Now LAX art. This isn't specifically a question about Barbara Kruger. I think it's about, this is just a very broad question about alternative art spaces, about LAX art, the building as an object, the building as an art object. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, I mean, in terms of as a question,
yeah.
You know, the thing about alternative spaces, and I think, you know, LAX art was founded as an alternative space. But the you know, what constitutes alternative depends on where and when the question is being asked, I would say, right? So in terms of Los Angeles in 2005, a space that would center around, in part, emerging talent, right? I mean, the landscape here in terms of the schools and stuff, you know, having a tier of talent that at that time, the number of places to show for artists who would still qualify as kind of emerging, you know, Um, uh, so it was founded, so that's what constituted alternative, you know, at that in 2005. Now the scene is quite different in terms of the number of places where emerging talent can show, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I still think that there's something, a through line from the emergence of alternative spaces in the 70s up through now, right? In terms of even, you know, how do they configure themselves with, you know, in relationship to an ever burgeoning art market, you know, in some sense. But also in just relationship to the socio-political climate, right? So to still argue that, you know, what alternative spaces were in the 1970s and how they configured themselves around a place to show a kind of production that fell well outside the bounds of just like, you know, painting and sculpture, right? Video performance, right? So in terms of a space to do things outside of commercial auspices, right? As a kind of a 70s paradigm for them, versus like a much more socio-political paradigm that those alternative spaces would take on in the 1980s, right? But I would say all of those things get folded into one another over time, right? In terms of the spirit of alternative spaces. But that, and those things are all still operative at you know, within their history. So I still like to think that that spirit, in some sense, even if the mission is broadened outside just like emerging artists per se, is still here, especially when it comes to like, you know, showing work that in some sense, you know, I mean, underrepresented voices, but basically anti-authoritarian, right? As in obviously the last 4 years. But in some sense, does that really represent a change in course? Not at all, right? So to say a lot of what art has been saying, you know, since the 60s, 70s, 80s, still needs to be said and underscored all the more against, you know, the, you know, last 4 years, right? So yeah, so that's in terms of thinking about alternative spaces, that if that, you know, addresses that point. But Barbara was I mean, this is such, it was a gift from her.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it was such a beautiful way to kick off, in some sense, you know, very early in terms of my tenure here. But my favorite story this is a young woman, and I don't know, this is the whole thing, it wraps around the building.
Yeah.
This a young woman, she was handing out, she was going to the galleries in this area. Sean's right down the street, Shulamit Nazarian, Reading Projects is down the street, Shulamit Nazarian, Michael Cohen is down the street. She was handing out her resume, and she came in and she gave me her resume, this young woman, and she said, I've been walking back and forth in front of this building for 5 minutes, and I was looking for the gallery and looking for the gallery, and then it hit me that this was the gallery.
You're right.
She said, my God, I thought that it was the most aggressive pawn shop ever, you know? And I just died laughing, and I was just like, that is hysterical, because there are a lot of pawn shops actually east of us, right? So I told Barbara, I said, Barbara, this young woman, she brought her resume in, and she said that she thought your piece was, that your piece made us look like the most aggressive pawn shop ever. And Barbara died laughing, and she said, that is one of the best critiques, reviews, commentary, or praise about my work ever. And then she said, I assume you hired her on the spot because of that. And I had to disappoint her and say, no, we did not hire her on the spot, but the praise still stands, you know, for the piece. So yeah, but really, and so as far as keeping this up, you know, subsequent, right now we have Carl Holmquist,
Yep.
have his piece up. So yeah, so this is, and it's even more urgent in terms of, since we, you know, with the pandemic, right?
Yep.
You know, us being down and closed, but still have some kind of offering to the public by way of the facade. Now, that said, when I came in, redoing the, renovating the space and the space used to be cobbled up into smaller galleries. I got rid of all of those for a big open floor plan, be more flexible, build out as needed per exhibition. But what that forced me to do as well at that time was to think of, right, so this is the interior one.
Yep.
So it made me think of the facade as another gallery, right? So the facade is actively another space, not just the facade, right? So
yeah, I was gonna like mention that, like, one of my favorite things about this building is that in a certain sense, like when you do a post commodity, like when you did the show with post commodity, right? Technically, post commodity is housed in a different artwork, right? And so the experience of say whatever work is on the exterior of the building conditions whatever's going on
right.
in the interior. Right. And so, like, I don't remember what shows were up. Was it Sperm Cult that was up while this, like, Barbara Kruger piece was outside?
Yes.
Yeah, Sperm Cult was
yeah,
up, right?
Yeah.
So we walk through this, and then it's Sperm Cult.
Right.
I think it might have even overlapped with that group show before that with the Paul. No. With the Sperm Cult had Oscar Toison, right? And Ariane Rines.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a banal observation on my part.
No, but I like that idea. You're in the belly of another beast. Right?
In my weaker moments, I'm like, I would say no. I'd be like, you're not gonna put my shit in the Barbara Kruger. like white out the Barbara Kruger, then put my shit inside. Like,
that's true.
But yeah, Saul LeWitt, this is just a code on, I guess, Saul LeWitt PageWorks. I mean, I know that your departure point, a big departure point for you sort of curatorially is publications. And I'm sort of aware that, I'm sure it's very, very similar to me, where, like, up until my mid 20s, let's say, I'd, like, never been to, like, Münster or Basel or Cologne or Munich or any of a number of places that sort of staged seminal shows from the 70s and 80s. And so part of how I learned the sort of history of conceptual art, contemporary art, was in bibliographies, or like looking at publications, sort of acquiring them. And so this, like, Saul LeWitt PageWorks show was kind of it's kind of the ultimate form of that kind of investigation, flipped literally into a show. And so I wanted to sort of ask you about the sort of genesis of the show.
Oh yeah, this is just a labor of love over some years. I've been, and it was my colleagues. It was Catherine Taft who goaded me into doing this. She would see I'd have these things laid out on the conference room table, and she was just like, "What? You have to share this stuff. This is out of control," essentially. And it didn't take that much prodding. And so I said, okay, let's see if we can do a small show. But in terms of the spirit of alternative spaces, to go back to an earlier, moment in conceptual art, where a generosity, right? That think about publications as a space in and of themselves, right? As an exhibition space. And then to think of the magazines, right? And PageWorks as works made by artists specifically for reproduction in magazines. Where it's not just like reproduction, but also reproduction distribution, right? Given the magazine. So work that's meant to be out there in the world, right? That also has the shelf life of a magazine. So it's a kind of production that even the author of the production, the artist behind the production, doesn't have a consciousness of how many of these things they may have done. Ed Ruscha came and saw the show, and it was beautiful. I was able to ask him, and he's done just as many probably as Saul LeWitt has, if he had any idea about where these things were. And he said no, he had no idea how many of these things he would have made. And I think that, the same would probably apply to LeWitt. So it was a bibliographic show. I don't know if you have pictures of the tables over.
Oh yeah, overhead.
6 feet long on these tables. Yeah. So these are he worked at 17 magazine, doing paste up essentially. Before becoming a full-fledged member of the art direction team at 17 magazine, 1953, 54, 55 is when he was at
Sorry, I want to go to Noise.
Yeah, Noise magazine. This is
I want to go to Noise
a
magazine.
beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I think this is stone lithography. You know, incredible, incredible piece. These page drawings for Art Forum. On the right, this is a collaboration with Robert Creeley that folds up. Morningstar Edition did these. It's kind of a broadsheet, a poetry broadsheet. Solowit and Robert Creeley collaborated. So in terms of its distribution out in the world, right? It's not just a poster, but I thought because it was being mailed out that it qualified as a page work in terms of its distribution. But this was just a way to indulge my little bibliographic fetish. Getting up on those entries and stuff and finding things, surprises, things that don't appear on any bibliography, you know. And it's ongoing, just a labor of love, but it was really nice to share. So I think a version of this will go to Chicago. The Astor said he wanted to take it at the bank. Him being an enabler in terms of my book habit. So yeah, but I think we should go to questions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think we're over.
Perfect.
There we go.
Hello. This was so wonderful. I can't believe we dusted an hour already. Before we move on to questions, I just want to mention to folks, because people might be filtering out, that Hamza is going to be back on April 15th at 4 p.m. in conversation with Allison Saar and Hank Willis Thomas as a part of something that is a partnership between CFAR, the Jordan Schnitzer Museum, Critical Conversations, and the Department of Art. We have a couple of conversations here from the group, but just based on the tail end of your conversation, I wanted to ask something before that about like institutional porosity. And, you know, throughout your conversation, I think Mahfuz mentioned like you offering up the Renaissance Society as raw material. We just talked about the kind of exterior space as an alternative gallery, as publications as kind of an alternative gallery. And it seems like in some ways it's raw material, but also in some ways it's like sacrificial material. And I'm curious, like, is there something in your biography that maybe predates curating, or something in like the way you kind of came up or developed that as a curator that that got you to be thinking so kind of I don't know, it seems like you're really open to kind of considering everything porous and everything for the taking.
Right, everything is. Everything is. I mean, it's not, I don't privilege, I mean, you know, do I privilege the institution, the gallery, the museum as a privileged site of meaning making, right? As opposed to like the arts experience. You know, do we reserve the arts experience for simply when we go to the museum and now I'm going to go and reflect upon what it means to be human, right? You know, this kind of a, you know, bourgeois humanism. Or are we capable of doing that in our everyday lives, right? I mean, we can talk and chew gum, right? Can we also live our lives and actually have kinds of, you know, reflections that we would think are reserved for the arts experience for, you know, the things that are around us. I don't care if it's a record cover or a wooden spoon, right? So to be able to you know, put things and along with that, well, I mean, I think a figure like Felix Gonzalez Torres is a perfect example. So I mean, it isn't, I follow the artist. Right? That's what the artwork is telling me to do that, right? So a figure like Felix is basically saying, you are free to go, right? Art is not an end in itself. It's the means to an end. It's about being able to see life, right? In a more reflexive fashion, right? It's about attenuating your thinking and your vision and stuff and applying that stuff to what you just see out in the world. So what's the difference between a pile of candy in a corner of the thing and the candy dish at the Lowe's movie theater? There's none. But now you see that Lowe's candy dish in a different way, right? As a thing about exchange and stuff. So that kind of equilibrium between art and life, right? And in Felix's case, it was just like a total diminution, right? In order to make that point, right? He was comfortable. If this is the LCD, the lowest common denominator, is going to be a fucking pile of candy, then so be it, right?
Mhm.
So that kind of thinking about, like, it's like, well, what about, and when does the art experience begin? Does it begin when you cross the threshold of the gallery? Or maybe it begins when you open up the newspaper. Maybe it was in a magazine. Maybe it's like, so can art just be out there in the world in some sense?
Yeah.
Right? So the porosity thing, can it perforate? In what ways can it perforate your life? So exhibition should be able to breathe, right? You know, to think about, it's like, is there a component that you can have just out there in the world in some sense, right? And to have an integrity to it. So to not just take it for granted and just put something out there, right? To be a little bit more careful about it, right? Because you still want it to be like art in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. But by the same token, you should be able to bring things into the gallery. So I always like shows that have a component that's like to have t-shirts in a show, right? Things that are just like, you know, pieces of popular culture, right? That fit right in, you know, in terms of what they have to say. So that kind of, you know, and I call it, you know, just like breathing. So things, you know, a show isn't so hermetic.
Yeah, I love this. We're going to lose Mahfuz in a second here. So I want to really thank you so much publicly, Mahfuz, before I move to the next question. Thank you so much. This was really, really special. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, thanks a lot. As I sort of leave, I want to leave Hamza with a question that I won't get to hear the answer to.
Ooh, okay,
Talk about. That's a
I'll call you right
follow-up on what you asked. You partially prompted
okay.
it. It's sort of, I kind of like feel like we're living in a time of sort of like immense sort of like curatorial self-importance, where like there's not enough, for lack of a better word, there's not enough fuckery in the culture, right? There are 10 objects on my table right now that are completely heterogeneous, and I'm going to do 10 shows named after the 10 objects that are on this table. And I think Hamza, you have a great anecdote that unfortunately I won't get to hear, but about names of shows and like naming shows, how when you were at the Wren in the library working through books, the sort of like realization about the rate of produce shows, and so
Yeah. But that was realizing, you know, it's funny, I was saying this, I was mentioning this anecdote to a group of students earlier, actually, that I had a chance to do our library, and I got to look at a couple hundred group exhibition catalogs, and to realize that thematic exhibitions about sand, puppets, UFOs, plastic, boxing, birds, hair, mothers, like it's like what was going to distinguish, shows, that exhibitions that I was going to do from these 200 exhibitions that I just started, and it was quite inspiring to realize, like, absolutely nothing. A show can be like this, and a show can be like that, and a show could be like this. A show is 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 a show, as opposed to thinking about like a certain preciousness behind the endeavor, as much as just like, can you come up with more flexible and fluid ways of just being able to accommodate showing artwork, right? And so and I felt like that was a lot more just like so to see all those things, and instead of feeling intimidated or daunted by those things, I felt totally liberated by looking at, the names of 200 thematic exhibitions and saying, it's like, oh, join the club, water's fine, dive in. So yeah, that's what he was referring to.
Yeah, this I think is a good segue to a question from the audience that I think unfortunately is probably our last question, but it seems like a lot of what you are talking about is like flattening and opening that leads to kind of different value systems through porosity and access and things like that. And it's about kind of like structure and affordance and historicity in a lot of ways. And there's a question from the audience that talked about with the popularization of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, in the kind of web realm. being is there a way that this is a mechanism for decolonization in the art world, or some kind of new inroad to explode things?
Well, the tail end of that, there's a lot more, let's say, optimism there than I think I would afford. I'm just learning about NFTs, and it's a joke. We have Samson is our resident millennial, and I specifically I put him on the beat. I said, Samson, at our next staff meeting, I want you to report back about these NFTs. and so now every staff meeting, we have them 3 times a week. I have to ask Samson. It's like, Samson, what's the NFT report? What's going on? And so we forward, these, as it's becoming more popular and learning more, we forward to each other the latest information on NFTs. So who knows where that stuff is going to go? I don't think of it. I mean, I don't see it as liberatory or decolonizing just because it's all about capital. This is about money. So in that way, it's not, and that's not a value judgment about it. But it's only a value judgment insofar as, do I see it as I see it as an extension of buying and selling and trading electronically, rather than something outside of that, or liberating us from the same forces that we want to say are responsible for colonization, imperialism, mercantilism. so yeah, but in terms of like, can more people do it and through the thing, it's like, I don't know if I buy into that as much. It's just like, whenever I see, just thinking about, works of art that blow my mind that are made out of nothing, right? Like just David Hammond's. I mean, it's just like, and to really get to a point where it's just like, damn, what can I say about the work of art other than sometimes it's just magic, and it's got, some people can rub 2 sticks together. They can have a stick and a piece of string and they'll blow your mind with a stick and a piece of string, right? They can blow your mind. And it has nothing to do with like a ton of steel, And so what is the art and the magic? It's, I don't think it has anything to do with like the liberatory potential of the digital space or anything along those lines at all. It's the same old, same old.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And I know it's not easy to come to this and be on the other side of the interview. And thank you so much for being vulnerable in that way with us. And I look forward to seeing you again in a month to be in conversation with Allison and Hank.
Yeah.
So I hope you have a wonderful night, Hamza, and everybody out there in Zoom land. Hope you have a great night.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.